Ah, Venice. To Italians, she's known as La Serenissima, the most serene republic. For 1,200 years, the city has performed a magical balancing act. Not quite land, not quite sea, Venice seems to float in its own world. A world that at first glance appears immune to the passing of time. The 900-year-old St. Mark's Basilica presides over a giant public square that's changed little since the days of Casanova and Vivaldi. But in recent years, the illusion that is Venice has begun to crack. And this idyllic city has been showing a darker side. The trouble began on November the 4th, 1966, when an extremely high tide swept into Venice and refused to leave. For 15 hours, Venice was inundated by the sea. In historic St. Mark's Square, the water was 4 feet deep. Luckily, no one was killed, but the place was a disaster zone. In a single day, the city and the world were forced to face a harsh reality. Venice was sinking into the sea. Today, flooding has become a fact of life. Instead of floating above the water, the 15th and 16th century buildings are often filled with it, and the ancient bricks are gradually dissolving away.
Venice is at a critical point. The problem of flooding must be solved right away.
But how can Venetians stop the flooding? Not only is the city sinking, but sea level is rising, here and all over the world.
It's happening. It's happening now. Venice is a trigger. Venice is the first major city in the world to face sea level rise because it's built right at sea level.
The Venice you know today cannot be preserved as it is today. It was built on a salt marsh at sea level in a sinking area, and unfortunately sea level is rising.
Is Venice's long and happy marriage to the sea destined for disaster? Or can the city of canals somehow be saved? Sinking City of Venice, up next on Nova. Several times a year, sirens sound along the canals of Venice. They can mean only one thing. The water is coming. Between October and January, the lowest parts of Venice flood almost every day, and much of the city is inundated half a dozen times. During this wet season, Venetians rarely venture far without their rubber boots. And sometimes even that's not enough. They call it acqua alta, high water.
It's this sort of slimy, murky water, which isn't very pleasant, but it also contains quite a bit of pollution. So you really don't want to stick your hand in this water or have this water in your entry to your house, in your hallway. Schools can't run, boats have troubles getting under the bridges. There's a whole series of dysfunctional things which happen with Acqua Alta.
It's not just inconvenient. The tide is insidious, creeping into every building without regard for its historical value. Salt water eats away at floors and walls, no matter what century they were built in or what genius architect designed them. The front of St. Mark's Basilica, perhaps the most famous Venetian landmark, is adorned with stones from around the Mediterranean. All of it is being corroded by floods, almost on a daily basis. Venice is famous as the city of romance, the city of Casanova, where lovers forget their worldly woes. It was once an extremely rich and powerful city, built by merchants and bankers who controlled a shipping empire throughout the Mediterranean. Her wealth and beauty flowed directly from the sea. So how is it that the water is now threatening to undo all that it made? In the case of Venice, it comes down to location, location, location. If you were planning to build a city, you could hardly pick a less practical spot. At the northern tip of the Adriatic Sea, historic Venice sits on what's actually several dozen islands within a 200 square mile shallow lagoon. A long chain of barrier islands guards the lagoon from the sea, but 3 openings in the chain allow ships and the tide access to the city. Flooding occurs when exceptionally high tides break through these inlets. Normally, the tides are controlled by the moon, but the sun also plays a role. These astronomical tides are easily predicted, and they aren't very extreme. The difference between high and low tide in Venice can be as little as an inch or 2, or it can be more than 3 feet during a full or new moon. But you can't blame the moon for Venice's flooding problems.
The Acqua Alta, those extreme high tides, are caused primarily by the weather. Strong winds out of the south driving Adriatic waters to the north and forcing it into the lagoon and causing flooding. So predicting Acqua Alta is really based on predicting storms. And it's not that easy.
Bad weather was the cause of the 1966 deluge. Wind and low pressure created a giant storm surge that pushed water into the lagoon and wouldn't let it out. The flood was a complete surprise. Since then, Venice has paid much more attention to the weather and its effect on the tides. Out on the Adriatic, 12 miles from shore, this platform collects data 24 hours a day. Temperature and humidity, wind speed, atmospheric pressure, anything that contributes to a storm surge. All this information is relayed to a team within the city. If flooding is predicted, then alarms go off. Given enough warning, Venetians can minimize the damage. Doorway barriers keep some water out of ground floor shops and apartments. But for most of the city, there's no stopping the sea. These events are becoming more frequent. A century ago, St. Mark's Square, the lowest point in Venice, flooded about 9 times a year. Nowadays, it happens about 100 times. Buildings in Venice were constructed to withstand some contact with the sea, but these floods are pushing them beyond their limits. To understand why, just look at a typical Venetian foundation. Here, a canal has been pumped dry for repairs, revealing a few of the secrets of the city's success and some of its major weaknesses. Strip off the outer layers of the foundation, and you'll find a forest of wooden pylons. These logs were pounded through the soft mud 10 or 15 feet to the bedrock below. Surrounding the pylons are several layers of water-resistant stone. As long as the sea washes against this lower level, the structure above is well protected. But now the flooding is rising beyond the stone foundation to the building itself, which in most of Venice is made of brick. The bricks, sometimes coated in stucco, are soft and porous and much more vulnerable to corrosion. Chemists at the University of Venice are studying how this works.
It's very interesting to see the effect of water on the sample, which is no different from what happens to the walls in Venice. I'm immersing the brick in a few millimeters of water that contains a small quantity of salt.
The salt travels up through the brick. As the water dries, the salt crystallizes. With every new flood, the salt dissolves once again and bores a little more into the brick. Eventually, the brick will crack and crumble away. This is what's happening inside all the walls of historic Venice. Almost everywhere, ground floors are damp and moldy. Many residents have moved upstairs or out of town. Since the 1950s, Venice has lost over half its population. Today, fewer than 70,000 people live here. Residents are trying to escape the flooding, but they're also running away from the tourists. About 15 million tourists pour into tiny Venice every year, and most of them stay less than a day. They drive prices up on everything from food to rubber boots. So, every day, Venice becomes less of a living city and more like a museum. A museum which is often very, very wet. But does it have to be this way?
Just look at the Netherlands. The whole country is below sea level and not a drop gets in. I don't see why we, who are nearly 3 feet above sea level in St. Mark's Square, are not able to stop this water.
The Netherlands used to be one of the most waterlogged nations on Earth, with more than half the country below sea level. Since the 1600s, legions of windmills have powered water wheels that lift water up into canals. These channels flowed back to the sea, which was held at bay by earthen dikes. But this system was not foolproof.